Okay, I'm going to start recording. All right, here we go. We're going to talk about grids. We're going to be moving into working with more type. And once we're talking about page layout, we need to organize this page that's going to be in front of us. So let's talk about what grids and how they are a tool to really help us organize and lay out our information. Grids are a skeletal framework used to control our content within a spatial field. Provides sequence of procedures for exploration and selection of content. Grids are there to help us. They help us to make decisions. They're not there to restrict us. I think sometimes when we start working with grids, we think they are kind of constraining us and not allowing us to do things. And in fact, what grids are really that foundation of the page layout. They really are important to help us make good decisions. It's focusing on structure and space. Space equals the common denominator for type. You know, a single letter is a point, a sentence is a line, and a paragraph is a plane. Type elements introduced into space, which is the page plane, creates divisions, creates spatial structure. So just laying words out in a blank space can feel very floaty, like you're out in outer space. They're just floating around. We lay a grid over a plane. It allows us to start organizing our content. This has been done since the beginning of written words and written forms. It's rooted in the earliest written forms from columns that were used in cuneiform and Egyptian hieroglyphs. You can see there are columns. There are the early stages of grids, segmenting information, organizing content. We moved into the into letterpress printing, movable type, emphasized rectangular grid structure because we literally were locking type into a frame, a rectangular frame. And we needed to organize information with lead put between lines and typing literally locked up. Then we got into more experiments in modern era with futurists and Dadaists, constructivists, the Distill movement. Breakthroughs at the Bauhaus contributed to its development, and we started skewing and using angles and curves and pushing the grid in a less rectangular form. Jan Schichold wrote The New Typography in 1928, and you can see on the cover design, this poster here, we're looking at bringing grids into perspective and really being much more experimental with our grid structure. But the country that really owns the grid, like was the king of the grid, if you will, is the Swiss. The modern grid, which we still use today, is really the Swiss standard. Designer Joseph Müller-Brockmann, grid systems and graphic design. He was a leader in the development of the international typographic style during the 50s and 60s. And whenever I see examples of Swiss design, the grid is so inherently in everything that is Swiss. You see the grid structure and the use of the grid, which is really kind of showing, as you can see in some of this work, you know, these alignments, making things align, making things connect, making things so they're not floating randomly. Everything has a purpose and a place. It's an aid, not a guarantee. It permits a number of possible uses, and each designer can look for a solution appropriate to his personal style. But one must learn how to use the grid. It is an art that requires practice. Joseph Müller-Brockmann. Well, of course, everything digital is using a grid, right? The grid system is emphasized on the screen. Everything on the screen is within a pixelized grid. So the three that we're going to focus on in this course are the columnar, the modular, and the improvisational. And so these are the three grids we're going to focus on. There are many, many more, and those are for more advanced study. But as we're an introduction to typography, we're going to focus on these three. So before we start with any layout, we must know the content. We must know what we're going to be putting on our page. So some of the things we need to make decisions on before we lay out our grid is understanding what type size, line length, and interline spacing or leading that we're going to use in our layouts. And we're going to be talking in depth about creating type studies to kind of make decisions on some of these before we move into our layouts. Because a change to any one requires an adjustment to all three. We'll talk a little bit more about what that means. So the first thing we need to determine when we're designing using paragraphs of copy is what is our leading point size. So these are three examples of 12-point type. The one on the left is 12-point over 12-point leading. The next one is 12-point type over 15-point leading. And the third is 12-point type over 18-point leading. We will need to decide which one of these we would use in our layout. What do you feel works the best of these three examples?
Probably 12, 18.
On screen, absolutely. I think if we were looking at this for screen, I definitely, I'm going to blow it up a little just so we can see it a little closer. I would agree 12 on 18 feels really good on screen. If we were doing this for print, I would look at the example of probably 12 on 15. This would be more traditional, what we would use for print. But because we're viewing this on a screen, 12 on 18 feels more comfortable for a screen, to seeing it on a screen. Oh, I made it too big, I think. Okay, there we go. So we would choose. So that means if we were going to go with the 18, that's our leading. We would make our horizontal grid or our baseline grid unit the same as our point size, which would be 18. So whatever our leading is the size of our baseline grid. Okay, so your grids need to align to your leading. Your lines of type will fall onto the baseline grid that can be used within the overall grid. So we're going to have a couple different grids we'll be working with. The first is the baseline grid. And on this illustration, the blue lines that you see, and I'm hoping you can see them clearly on screen, these blue lines are the baseline grid. And I want you to know, and I'm going to zoom in a little. The blue lines are the baseline grid, and the type sits right on the baseline. And you see that the body copy, the caption, the headline, the subhead, everything is sitting on the baseline, which is the blue lines. I'm going to zoom out again. So, but you can see I'm using different type sizes. So the headline is 32 points on a 48 leading. The subhead is 18 points on 24 leading. The caption is 9 on 12, and the primary text is 10 on 12. So you'll notice that we have 12-point leading, 24-point leading, and 48-point leading. So in other words, our baseline grid is set on our body copy leading, which is 12. That means our headlines and our subheads need to be multiples of 12 to stay on our baseline leading. So that means 24 is a multiple of 12 and 48 is a multiple of 12. So they all work within the baseline grid. Are you guys following?
So is there like a certain body of text you should set first and then base everything else off of?
Yes, your body copy. So the first one you're going to figure out is your body copy. That's going to determine the baseline grid for the entire layout.
Okay.
Yep. So your body copy is the one we'll do our studies with. Our type studies will all be done with our body copy, because that's the one, once we've determined what our body copy should be laid out at, then all of our other elements can be a multiple of that body copy's leading. So we're noticing that the cross alignment. So in other words, when everything is sitting on the baseline grid, they connect. So you'll notice over in the what's in red is a modular grid that's laid on top. So there's a couple key things that are happening. All of the type is sitting on the baseline grid, but it's also fitting in the framework of the modular grid. So the outer edge of the page is out here. We've created a margin. There's a margin around the page so that type doesn't get too close to the edge of the page. And then we've created these modules. And there's an active corner, which is the upper left-hand corner, which is the active corner of each module. So each time we start a new information or new piece of copy, it starts in that upper left-hand corner. So the baseline grid headline starts in this upper left-hand corner. The subhead is offset starting in the next column, column 2. Column 1 also has the caption, and it's set on the exact same baseline grid in the upper left-hand corner of the third module down, and the body copy is in the second column, third module down, so on and so forth. So in order for us to start thinking about baseline grids, layouts, modular grids, columnar grids, one of the things we want to start with is kind of getting our ideas down on paper. So just like we were sketching out our type treatments for our first 2 projects, we're going to be using sketching. This time though, we're going to be using our grid paper to help us focus on layouts of grids. This time we're going to be focusing on grids and the page layout much more so than the bot and then the copy itself. Now it's more about laying out the copy on the page, not what the actual type is going to look like. So looking at when you have a multi-page document with lots of pictures and titles and body copy, there needs to be a way to sketch it out. So these, this image I have here to share with you is about thinking about the way we identify different pieces of copy. Looking at just squares, indicating where images are going to go. A title can be just simply zigzagged or sketched out as a title, and body copy itself can just be indicated with lines. If they're lined up this way where they're flush on left and right, that's telling me it's justified text. So when we're looking at printed pieces, I put this in here because I want to see if you're seeing the grid and looking at the arrangement of information. So when we're looking at this, we can see the various elements and how they're organizing. Here's a 2-column. Here, this page over here is showing me that it would be a 4-column grid. The first column they're skipping and moving the content into the last 3 columns. Over here, we're looking at 3 columns, so on and so forth. So we're going to talk about 3 different ways to proportion your page. And that is ratios, the golden section, and the Fibonacci sequence. Ratios are something that's just simply a mathematical relationship between 2 grid measurements, govern signs and placement of text and image. We often innately, think about the rule of thirds, right? You've probably had many of your art or design classes in the past that have talked about the rule of thirds, that you kind of want to break things up a 1/3 to 2/3 ratio. That's really a common way to think about balancing out any design or creative, any composition. So the rule of thirds can be vertical or horizontal, but all the 9 spaces always have to be the exact same size. The elements in design are positioned in 2 ways. Focus points are placed according to where the lines cross from top left, top right, bottom left, and then bottom right. So by following the rules of thirds, you're making sure that your design is balanced in proportion. It's been used in graphic design and also in photography. So this is an example of a layout that's done in the rule of thirds. 2/3 is the picture, 1/3 is the type. The next example is the golden section. Have you all heard of the golden section in some of your other art and design courses?
No.
No? Okay. Golden section is constructed from a square, and it's kind of concentric squares. So it's basically 1 to 1.618. And this is an example of it. It's like you take a square and then it keeps dividing and dividing, and it's found in nature. Here's a layout that's done using the golden section. So you can see, here's the first square, here's the second square, third square, fourth square, and it keeps getting smaller and smaller, and it spirals kind of like a seashell. The Fibonacci sequence is a number, is the sum of 2 of the preceding numbers. So 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 34, 55, 89, etc. How can this be used for type? Well, here's an example of a series of type sizes based on the Fibonacci sequence. So the basic sequence beginning at 1 and continuing up. So in other words, as another way to think about ratios is the idea of like balancing out your choices for your type size on your page based on the Fibonacci sequence. Meaning, so like your headlines might be 55, your subheads 21, your body copy 8. You know what I'm saying? So you can use that as another tool so that you can see that it's a natural progression of proportion. You can also double it. So as the numbers in the Fibonacci sequence increase, the proportion between any 2 numbers closely approximate the golden section. So there's a lot of very similar elements in the golden section and the Fibonacci sequence. All right, so now we're going to talk about some of these grid layouts and how we break down the planes of our page. So the most familiar one, I'm sure you're familiar with, is the columnar grid. It's a single column text block, is used for most book spreads. Most of the books you have are, especially like a novel or many books that are a lot of textbooks are just a single column text block used for book spreads mainly and correspondence. Usually letters are, of course, a single column. So the general feeling is static and it's very traditional. Sometimes they're centered, sometimes they're offset, sometimes they're mirroring each other, as this bottom one is. Multiple columns is much more flexible. It's commonly used in magazine design, editorial. Think about your newspapers, magazines, different sell sheets, brochures. Those are all usually set with multiple columns. It's allowing us to get a combination of images and type coordinated on the page. So you can see in some of these examples, there's a combination of multiple columns of type, body copy, and imagery. Modular grid is a cousin of the columnar grid. In typography, the modular grid unit is usually derived from leading, creating a baseline grid. So here's kind of the dissection of it. So as I said earlier, we have margins. We always start all of our layouts with using margins. We're then going to be adding flow lines into the columns. Then each is creating these squares. These squares we refer to as modules. When we group these modules together, we create spatial zones. And the space between all of them is gutters. The importance of margins is they define what we call live area of a page. We don't want our type to go right up to the edges of the page when we're designing for print, because we don't want our type to get cut off. So we like to create what we call as the safe area or the live area of a page, where we know elements are far enough away from the edge of the page so that when we go to print and they get trimmed, we're in a book or a magazine, we know that nothing important is going to get cut off. So it's very important to have that buffer, and we call that a live area. Flow lines are the lines that break the space into horizontal bands. They're used as a starting point for text and images. These flow lines are going to be aligned with our baseline grid. The active corner of the module is always the upper left-hand corner. And that is your active corner. That is where we want to organize the beginning of an image, the beginning of a body of a text body, a headline, always in an active corner. And creating these spatial zones are creating spaces for either blocks of copy or imagery. Gutters are separating fields from each other. So this is a 3-column layout. I can have my body copy each column be in 3 columns, or I can have it be in 2 columns, and then 1 column be an area where I put captions, or maybe just imagery, or maybe my body copy's in 1 column and 2 columns are used for imagery. That's the flexibility of it. And that's what a column is referencing, just that one area. And it goes right through all of it's the vertical alignment. Markers are places where we might add page numbers, maybe the title of a publication, maybe a footer that would go in the margin. Again, still not too close to the edge, but still in the margin outside of the original live area. So you can span columns to create new spatial zones. So in this example, what I was just saying earlier is you have a 2-column layout, 2 columns of text in that 3-column layout, so that we're using spreading our type over 2 columns on the left here, and then using only the single column for the type on the right. The last one we're going to talk about is improvisational structures. This is a flexible construction process that involves inserting typographic forms in space to establish form and content relationships, substituting these forms with revised forms as necessary, and omitting forms. So this is, kind of an area where we learn the rules in order to break the rules. So I thought I had another image. Let me zoom into this one. Over here. Okay, so you can see I've illustrated above here, the posters built upon dynamic relationships. So you can see there is a very minimal grid structure underneath, but there's also this one column that has been turned onto an angle. And so if we look at the layout here with the artwork on it, you can see the elements that are in that diagonal elements, plus the elements that are in the 2 columns that were developed up above. Okay, any questions as we start thinking about grids and kind of starting to create a framework for more page layout?
No, not really. Not yet.
All right. Well, we're going to jump into a project, like I said, for homework this week, kind of entering into the world of grids and starting to, get into InDesign and start using it. Moving forward in the semester, we're going to be moving into InDesign. After this project, we're leaving Illustrator and moving into InDesign. And next class, I will be doing a demo of setting up our grids in InDesign and start introducing some of our type tools within InDesign.